All right, jumping right in. Today, we're looking at, something that's become sadly familiar, Islamic terror attacks, specifically in London.
Hmm.
Our source material focuses mainly on the Westminster Bridge attack
Right.
from March 23, 2017. But it uses this event to kind of springboard into some much wider and honestly pretty controversial ideas about how the West is dealing with this whole situation.
Yeah, it's striking how the source immediately takes this London attack and puts it in
Yes.
this global context.
Yeah.
It talks about how major cities, Sydney, New York, Berlin, are almost bracing themselves for these kinds of things. And it
Yeah.
makes you wonder if we're reaching a point where terrorism is just becoming expected.
It's a disturbing thought, yeah.
Yeah.
And the source brings up those images. We've all seen landmarks lit up in those somber colors after an attack.
Yeah.
It's almost like it's become a ritual, a tragic spectacle we've sadly gotten used to.
Exactly. And that feeds into one of the most eyebrow-raising points in the source. The focus on Sadiq Khan, London's mayor, and his infamous statement that terrorist attacks are part and parcel of living in a major city.
Hmm.
When Khan is a Muslim himself, so for him to say that, it really struck a nerve with people.
Yeah, it's a hard one to unpack, isn't it? Because on one hand, you could argue he's just being pragmatic. Big cities, unfortunately, are targets.
Right.
But it also feels like he's minimizing the fear and the very real trauma these attacks cause.
That's the key question,
Yeah.
right? Is this a callous dismissal, a grim acceptance of modern life, or something else entirely?
Yeah.
The source doesn't explicitly say, but it does make you think about how leaders communicate about these events and the impact those words have.
Absolutely. And it gets even more pointed when the source lays out this satirical list of the 6 steps of how the West supposedly responds to attacks, cartoons, social media filters, public mourning, all these symbolic gestures. And then life goes back to normal.
Yeah, it's like the source is saying we're going through the motions without truly confronting the root causes.
Hmm.
Think about it. After 9/11, there was this massive global shift. Wars were launched, security measures ramped up. But with these more recent attacks, the response feels different.
Almost muted, like we're weary or maybe even resigned.
It makes you wonder if there even is a right way to respond to something as horrific as terrorism.
Right.
But the source clearly thinks we're falling short, that our current approach is superficial and ultimately ineffective.
Okay, so we've got the sense of complacency, a lack of effective response, and then the source takes things in an even more controversial direction.
Yeah.
It brings up the Rotherham child sexual exploitation scandal, which is just a horrifying case where gangs of Pakistani men were convicted of systematically abusing young girls.
And this is where the source tries to link its critique of how we deal with terrorism to a broader issue of multiculturalism in the West. It claims there's a reluctance to address the negative aspects of cultural diversity, especially when it involves certain immigrant groups.
It's walking a tightrope there for sure, because raising legitimate concerns about integration is one thing, but it's easy to slip into dangerous generalizations.
Yep.
You can't condemn an entire group of people for the actions of a few, right?
Absolutely. But the source is clearly trying to make a connection here. Whether it's a valid one or not is something we need to unpack further, because then it goes on to lay out this idea of a three-pronged attack by Islam on the West. And that's where things get really heated.
Yeah, I remember reading that and thinking, whoa, hold on a second.
Yeah.
It talks about hard jihad, meaning violence, demographic jihad through mass migration, and then this idea of weaponized Western values where tolerance and resources are supposedly exploited. Those are some loaded terms.
They are. And it's important to dissect what the source is actually saying here. Is this a genuine concern backed up by evidence? Or is it a biased and alarmist view? We need to look at each of these prongs carefully.
Right.
For example, what does weaponizing Western values even mean in practice?
Right, because we need to understand what the source is actually alleging before we can even begin to assess if those claims hold water. And this goes beyond just terrorism. Now we're talking about a potential cultural and demographic shift. The source even asks if the West is playing the fiddle while its own culture erodes. It's a pretty stark image.
It is, and it's designed to be provocative. The source is presenting a very particular perspective, one that views Islam and mass immigration as significant threats to Western civilization. Now, whether that's a fair assessment or a fear-mongering tactic is something we need to unpack, because there's a huge difference between acknowledging legitimate challenges and falling into Islamophobia or xenophobia.
So we've got a lot to dig into here. A specific terror attack in London has led us to this much broader discussion about how the West responds to terrorism, the complexities of multiculturalism, and this provocative idea that Western culture itself might be at risk.
And this is where things get really interesting, because the source doesn't offer easy answers. It's pushing us to confront some uncomfortable questions about the future of the West in a rapidly changing world.
And it's up to us to examine those questions critically, to separate fact from opinion, and to form our own conclusions. So let's dive deeper, shall we? So we've got these big overarching ideas about cultural shifts and the West's response to terrorism, but I want to bring it back to the Westminster attack for a moment because the source makes an interesting point about the method used, a vehicle as a weapon. It's sadly become a more common tactic, hasn't it?
It has, and that feeds into this idea of normalization we were talking about.
Right.
A car, a truck, these are everyday objects that suddenly become instruments of terror. It's disturbing how these methods, which once seemed shocking, are almost becoming expected.
Like the source says, it's almost as if we've become desensitized to the horror, and maybe that's why the response feels so inadequate. But you mentioned 9/11 and how the response to that was so different. Back then, there was a sense of global unity. Everyone felt the impact. Do you think the fact that these attacks are more localized played a role?
It's definitely part of it. With 9/11, there was this feeling that Western civilization itself was under attack. But with these more recent attacks, often targeting specific cities or communities, it's easier for people to distance themselves. And I think the source is tapping into a fear that we're becoming too fragmented, too focused on our own individual bubbles to truly confront this shared threat.
That makes sense. And the source also points out that even though these attacks feel localized, they're rarely isolated incidents. It explicitly connects the Westminster attack to the Brussels bombings, which happened almost exactly a year earlier.
Right, and that highlights the international network aspect of these extremist groups. It's not just lone wolves acting independently. There's often coordination, communication, and a shared ideology driving these actions.
And I think that's what the source is trying to get at with this idea of a three-pronged attack. It's not just about physical violence. It's about a deeper, more insidious erosion of Western culture and values.
Exactly. So let's break down these three prongs a bit further. We've talked about hard jihad, the direct violence, but what about demographic jihad through mass migration? How does the source support that claim?
Well, it points to the changing demographics of Europe in particular and argues that mass immigration, especially from Muslim-majority countries, is being used to deliberately shift the cultural balance of the West.
Okay, so we need to be careful here because on one hand, demographics change over time, and migration is a complex issue with a lot of factors at play. But the source is suggesting that this is a deliberate strategy, part of a larger plan to undermine Western civilization. Do they provide any evidence to back that up?
Not really hard evidence, no. It leans more on rhetoric and generalizations about Muslim birth rates and the supposed incompatibility of Islam with Western values.
See, that's where the source gets shaky. It's presenting opinions and anxieties as facts without really backing them up, and it's ignoring the vast diversity within the Muslim community itself.
Right, painting an entire group of people with a single brush, and then there's the third prong, weaponize Western values. What does the source even mean by that?
It's basically arguing that extremists are exploiting Western tolerance and openness to further their own agenda. The source claims things like freedom of speech, legal systems, even social welfare programs are being weaponized to undermine Western societies from within.
So they're saying that by being tolerant and welcoming, the West is actually making itself vulnerable to attack.
That's the gist of it. It's a provocative argument, but it's also a dangerous one because if you take it to its logical conclusion, it implies that the solution is to become a less tolerant, a less open. That's a slippery slope.
It is, because the source is essentially saying, look, we tried multiculturalism, we tried tolerance, and it's backfiring, but is that really a fair assessment?
I don't think so. It's a very simplistic view that ignores the complexities of integration, the benefits of diversity, and the fact that the vast majority of Muslims living in the West are peaceful and law-abiding citizens.
Okay, so the source is making these sweeping generalizations about Islam and immigration, and then it takes things even further by invoking Enoch Powell and his infamous Rivers of Blood speech.
Ah, yes, that's a loaded reference for sure.
Yeah.
Powell's speech back in 1968 warned about the dangers of mass immigration and predicted racial conflict in Britain.
Right.
It was hugely controversial at the time, and it's still seen as a symbol of anti-immigrant sentiment. So why do you think the source brings it up?
Well, it seems to be suggesting that Powell was right, that his warnings were ignored and now we're reaping the consequences. It's a way of tapping into those anxieties about cultural change and demographic shifts.
It is, and it's a dangerous game to play because while it's important to acknowledge that people have legitimate concerns about immigration, Powell's speech was full of fear-mongering and racist rhetoric. And the source is walking a very fine line here.
It is, because it's one thing to raise concerns about integration or security, but it's another thing entirely to suggest that an entire religion or culture is inherently incompatible with Western values.
Exactly, and I think that's where the source starts to lose credibility. It's presenting a very one-sided alarmist view without really engaging with the complexities of the issue.
It's like it's trying to stir up fear and division rather than foster understanding and dialogue, but it does raise an interesting point about public opinion. The source argues that the concerns of ordinary people about immigration have been ignored by the political elite and that this disconnect is part of the problem.
Okay, so that's a valid point. Public opinion does matter, and it's important for governments to listen to the concerns of their citizens. But the question is, how do you balance those concerns with the need for fair and humane immigration policies?
Right, because you can't just swing to the other extreme and base your policies on fear and prejudice. It's about finding that middle ground, that balance between security and compassion.
Exactly, and that's where the source falls short.
Yeah.
It's presenting a very black and white view of a very complex issue. It's saying, look, the West is under attack, our culture is being eroded, and it's all the fault of Islam and mass immigration. But the reality is far more nuanced than that.
It is, and I think it's important for us as critical thinkers to recognize those nuances, to challenge those oversimplifications, and to engage in a more balanced and informed discussion about these issues.
Absolutely, because at the end of the day, we're all trying to figure out how to live together in an increasingly diverse and interconnected world. And that requires understanding, empathy, and a willingness to listen to different perspectives.
So we've got a lot to unpack here. We've talked about the normalization of terror, the challenges of multiculturalism, the source's controversial three-pronged attack theory, and this unsettling connection to Enoch Powell's rivers of blood speech. It's a lot to process.
It is, but I think the most important takeaway is the need for critical thinking. We can't just blindly accept the source's claims, no matter how provocative or alarming they might seem. We need to examine the evidence, consider alternative perspectives, and form our own conclusions.
And maybe, just maybe, we need to be a little less afraid of having those uncomfortable conversations, because if we can't talk openly and honestly about these issues then we'll never find solutions that work for everyone.
I agree. Silence and avoidance won't make these problems go away. We need to engage with them head on, with courage and compassion.
Okay, so we've tackled some heavy stuff here. We've explored the aftermath of a terror attack, delved into the complexities of multiculturalism, and confronted some uncomfortable truths about the challenges facing the West. Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about what all of this means for you, the listener. How does this information connect to your own life and experiences?
That's a great question, because while we've been focusing on the broader societal implications, it's important to remember that these issues have a very real impact on individuals.
Exactly, so we want to hear from you. What resonates with you most from our discussion? What questions or concerns does it raise for you?
Think about your own community, your own experiences with diversity and cultural exchange. Have you encountered any of the challenges or anxieties that the source brings up?
And more importantly, how do you think we can move forward in a way that promotes both security and understanding? These are tough questions, but they're ones we need to grapple with if we want to create a more just and equitable world.
Absolutely. So we encourage you to continue the conversation, to share your thoughts and perspectives, and to be part of the solution.
Because at the end of the day, we're all in this together. Building a more just and equitable world requires collaboration, understanding, and a willingness to embrace our shared humanity. So keep asking questions, keep challenging assumptions, and keep the conversation going. That's how we move forward together.
It feels like we've been circling around this central tension, this clash between wanting to be open and welcoming, but also needing to feel safe and secure. How do you reconcile those two impulses? It's the fundamental challenge of our time, isn't it? And the source we've been diving into really leans into the idea that the West is failing at this balancing act. That we're sacrificing our own security on the altar of tolerance.
And it connects that back to this idea of normalization, right? Like the more we accept these attacks as part and parcel of living in a major city, the more vulnerable we become.
Exactly. If we become numb to the threat, we lose the motivation to confront it. But the source also offers this alternative narrative, this almost apocalyptic vision of Western civilization crumbling under the weight of its own ideals.
The fiddling while Rome burns metaphor, yeah. But is that really a fair assessment?
Right.
Are we truly on the brink of collapse, or is the source exaggerating the threat?
That's where critical thinking comes in, because the source is playing on very real fears and anxieties, but it's also offering a very simplistic and frankly dangerous solution. Essentially, turning inward, rejecting diversity, and doubling down on what it sees as traditional Western values. It's a recipe for division, for creating an us versus them mentality.
And that's exactly the kind of thinking that leads to prejudice and discrimination. It's important to remember that the vast majority of Muslims are peaceful, law-abiding citizens who contribute to their communities. We can't let fear and generalizations dictate our policies or our interactions with each other.
Absolutely. And I think the source is missing a crucial point, that diversity, when managed thoughtfully, can actually be a strength. It brings new ideas, new perspectives, new energy to our societies.
Right. It's about finding ways to bridge those cultural divides, to build understanding rather than walls. And that starts with dialogue, with being willing to listen to each other's perspectives, even when they're uncomfortable or challenging.
Exactly, because shutting down conversations, silencing dissenting voices, that only breeds more fear and mistrust. It's by engaging with these difficult issues head on that we can start to find common ground.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the key takeaway you want to leave our listeners with?
I think it's this. Don't let fear paralyze you. Don't let inflammatory rhetoric cloud your judgment. Engage with these issues critically, thoughtfully, and with a commitment to finding solutions that work for everyone.
Because at the end of the day, we're all in this together. Building a more just and equitable world requires collaboration, understanding, and a willingness to embrace our shared humanity. So keep asking questions, keep challenging assumptions, and keep the conversation going. That's how we move forward together.